Hey everybody, welcome to the New Deal New Minute for October 13th, 2020. A lot to get to, mainly focused on the confirmation hearing of Amy Coney Barrett. Today was the second day of the confirmation hearings for Donald Trump's nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. And today we saw questioning from the senators on the Judiciary Committee. Largely, we saw what we've seen with Neil Gorsuch and to an extent Brett Kavanaugh, where you have Republicans bolstering the nominee and Democrats being more critical. What's interesting with her nomination is that her appointment to the court could have real consequences for things like the Affordable Care Act, for Roe v. Wade and abortion rights for women, and for the election, should it have to go to the Supreme Court to be decided, which fingers crossed it won't, because hopefully Joe Biden wins by a large margin. But to stay on today's hearings, the Democrats focused mainly on the position of healthcare. They didn't get too much into the election or the abortion rights, although some senators did hit on those topics. But what's at stake is there's a court hearing coming up in November where they will decide essentially the fate of the Affordable Care Act, and that case is California versus Texas. And largely, Amy Coney Barrett was not, or tried to be non-political in her answering of the senators' questions in regard to how she might vote or how she might side on that issue. But what I thought was interesting is she ended up giving a very political answer. So when she was asked about the case, she said, well, the case isn't about pre-existing conditions. It's not really about, the individual mandate necessarily. It's about, so none of the healthcare rights of people are really at stake in this case. And that was a really interesting way of putting it, because what the case is actually, it's called a severability case. And so basically, when the ACA was passed under Obama, it included something called an individual mandate, where all people were required to have insurance, or you had to pay a penalty in the form of a tax penalty to the IRS come tax time. When Donald Trump took office, they simply lowered that fine to zero, effectively nullifying any penalty. So you're still technically supposed to be covered by healthcare, but there's no penalty for not. What this case is looking to do is decide if the removal of the individual mandate or the rendering ineffective of the mandate will gut the ACA to the point where the ACA can't stand on its own. And to me, it's like, well, the ACA is so much more comprehensive that how could removing the mandate nullify the ACA? But that's what's at stake. If the Supreme Court rules that the individual mandate being removed from the ACA is enough to nullify the whole thing, you do lose pre-existing conditions. You lose your access to government healthcare outside of Medicare and things like that. And so very quickly, between 10 and 15 million Americans will lose their insurance immediately. And they may not be able to get it back because pre-existing conditions will no longer be covered. And being removed from the Affordable Care Act, pre-existing conditions will not need to be covered in private insurance either. So the protections are removed. If you're 26 and you're insured under your parents, that goes away. You're going to have to find your own insurance, which means you probably won't get insurance. So it's just interesting. I thought that she put a spin on that answer where, she knows the weight of the situation. So I just thought it was really interesting that she could kind of tried to downplay the importance of the case. One thing that I thought was really interesting as well was Senator Whitehouse's 30-minute presentation on dark money in the Supreme Court and how money and corporations are effectively trying to take the court over. And I'm going to put a link in the video to that because it was fascinating to watch. But it really goes to show that there are these groups and these donors out there that are pouring tons of money, not only into the nomination process, who gets selected, but also for what cases go to the Supreme Court. They file the cases to go to the Supreme Court. He mentioned that sometimes they ask to lose on purpose at the lower levels just so the case will be elevated to the higher courts. So that was an interesting presentation. And money being involved in our politics at all is extremely dangerous. And more, since the Citizens United decision, we're seeing campaign donations, cumulatively over $1 billion. These campaigns are now $1 billion expenditures. With that's all American money. That's money coming from corporations and out of people's pockets to donate for these candidates. And imagine how that money could be spent if there was a cap on campaign finance, or if there was a cap on corporate expenditure, or we didn't allow corporations to donate at all. So money in politics is very dangerous, and Citizens United decision is very dangerous. So that video is really interesting. But I think the reason why we're here today, the reason why we've had 2 or 3 very contentious Supreme Court nomination processes under Donald Trump, it's not because of the corporate donations. It's not because of dark money, although that plays a part. The issue is the nuclear option in the Senate voting. Prior to Donald Trump coming into office, it required 60 votes to appoint a Supreme Court nominee to the Supreme Court. 60. Republicans will argue that Democrats lowered that to 50 for federal judges, and therefore they have a right to do it for Supreme Court justices, even though the Democrats reserved the 60 votes for the Supreme Court. They did not touch that. When Donald Trump came into office, the Republicans said, we're going to go nuclear on Supreme Court. We only need 50 votes. We're going to vote along party lines. And that's what's been dangerous for this country. If a 60 vote threshold needs to be met to appoint a nominee, that means that any nominee in this administration would need, at least nine Democrats to go along with it, and vice versa. Should the Democrats take the Senate and the Democrats appoint a nominee, they would need X amount of Republican senators to go along with them, which means you need to be appointing justices who are actually well qualified, who meet a threshold, who you're not just throwing up there because they're in their 40s and they're going to be on the court forever. Quality judges. And it would solve all the problems. And we need a constitutional amendment that says you need a 60 vote threshold to be met in order to appoint a Supreme Court justice to the court, because that is the only way that we're going to have any form of an independent Supreme Court with as little influence as possible from Congress. But as long as we're voting along party lines and selecting our nominees based on party and then pretending that they're not political installments, I don't think we're that naive as Americans. But it is our duty as American citizens to demand action for fairness. And that means, I think, a constitutional amendment saying we need to get the 60 votes back, and it needs to be permanent. It should not be up to the leader of the Senate to change that rule whimsically. So that's today's New Deal, New Minute. There will be more hearing confirmations later this week. I'm sure it will be good. We're approaching the election. New episode of the podcast later this week, and we may have a special guest on the podcast next week, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for listening into the New Deal, New Minute, and I will see you guys tomorrow.